Hi, I'm Andrew McLaren.
And I'm Mark Ridley.
Welcome to the Teamcraft podcast,
where we talk about the tradecraft and sometimes the witchcraft of what it means to work together in a team.
Our guest today is Mark Ridley. If you've listened to the podcast so far, you'll know that Mark is my co-host. We received some feedback that people would like to hear a bit about us, how we got to be so interested in teamwork, and what our own current thinking is on some of the themes we cover in our conversations with guests. Mark is a Chief Technology Officer with over 2 decades of experience that span the dotcom boom and crash and a global technology revolution. Expect to hear about what tech gets right and wrong with teamwork, how an experience with the RAF changed Mark's perspective on teamwork, followership, psychological safety, trust, and much more.
Even though I work in technology and generally the outcome of what the teams that I work with is technology, fundamentally, my job is to work on the teams, not to work on the technology. They do the technology, I do the teams. And so not only was it professionally something that I spend a lot of time doing, but it's also been something that personally I'm incredibly interested in, have been interested about ever since I was all the way back at university, where I found myself, I was doing a psychology degree where generally people were not looking at organizational behavior. They were generally looking that the people that I was studying with would generally go into the NHS or into the health service or into the prison service or to work with kids. And I think I was probably about the only outlier in my entire year that I knew of.
You were the only capitalist pig.
I was the only capitalist organizational behavior. Yeah, it's like, yeah, I'm going to do the economics classes. I have absolutely no interest in this Freudian nonsense. So yeah, if it was cognitive psychology or organizational behavior, you had my attention, but otherwise I didn't. So that really didn't play any part at all in my choice of career or anything. It was just something that I found fascinating at the time. And then I think the curiosity, like I took no other benefit from my degree other than the curiosity that I'd had, then sort of established itself as a fairly defining part of what I do in my career, which is thinking about teams in tech businesses.
Teams have been quite a foundational feature of your professional interest from the start.
Yeah, right from the beginning. And what was really interesting is I had absolutely no interest in academia. When I went to university, I was literally just taking whatever degree I thought I could possibly get to get into work as soon as possible, being a capitalist pig. Very single-minded teenager. How do I possibly earn the most amount of money? I'm going to go into management without any idea of what management was, but yeah, effectively, I modelled my entire career off Michael J. Fox in Secret of My Success. So, yeah, good 80s, I think 80s, maybe 90s, early 90s film reference. So I thought, this is the path to corner office, and it's been a very different journey since then. But right from the very beginning, when the first business that I joined, I got very lucky with the business that I joined. That I was given, I was offered an enormous amount of freedom because of the nature of the business that it was and the time that I joined it. But I joined what was essentially a very small team, a team of about 4 people inside a business that was about 3,500 people. But we were doing something entirely different. So we were given all of this leniency.
What was that?
So the business I joined was actually a recruitment agency, so a traditional recruitment agency called Reed. And that was when I joined it about 3,500 people in the UK, almost at that point, almost entirely in the UK. And it was probably the 3rd largest recruitment agency in the UK, very traditional.
So when you say traditional, that means?
So, and what I mean by that is they had about 300 branches in high streets across the UK, so main streets across the UK. And the branches had job descriptions in the windows. Administrator, 18k, finance assistant, 20k. That right. Was their go-to market. So actually, to an extent, it was almost a a real estate business that their job was find the best properties to put the adverts in windows. So that was the business that I joined, and I joined the 4 people looking after the website, which was really interesting. And they were the team that I joined. 2 of them were getting faxes from these 3,000 recruitment consultants that were sending the job descriptions to put on what somebody had decided to call the internet. So I joined just before the dotcom boom, and so I was in this tiny team, and I was, because I was given a relative amount of authority relatively quickly, because nobody else really knew what I was doing. It was this moment in time where I knew nothing, but the other people around me didn't know any more than I did. So I got to take some authority quite quickly. I then started recruiting people. I remember the first interview I ever did, I had absolutely no training for. Somebody just said, interview this person, and I was terrified. I can guarantee that the state that I was in, because
you were more scared than the candidate.
Yeah, you know that the candidate is supposed to be nervous. I was absolutely terrified. What am I supposed to do here? So I had no idea. But that was my experience of working with a team, and almost to an extent, the person that we successfully took from that recruitment process became one of this first group, like these strong memories that you have of the early teams that you're with. That person that I hired then became somebody that was, literally my double, my partner for in this job for maybe the next 6 or 7 years. Was there for ages, and I was just incredibly lucky because I was in that one company for 18 years. And I was incredibly lucky that I went through the whole scaling experience. When I left, there were 350 people. My team was around 100. And I'd still interviewed every single person in there. So I'd had to learn organically. And the thing that was really beneficial was we had all of this freedom from being a very small part of this big business, but we had the backup of being a bigger business. And also this really weird situation where it's still family owned. So the business was started by Alec Reed in 1960, and his son James was just on the ascendancy, just stepping up into the CEO and chairman roles as I was joining the business. So I came through in the second wave of evolution of that business, where James needed his thing, and the internet was the thing that became his. Yeah,
good choice.
Yeah. It was, he definitely picked the right people for it as well.
Absolutely. It sounds like you were almost in a little startup within a business.
Yeah, I think I thought I was much more than I was, which was really interesting. So where I was in a small team, and we were given a budget, and we had an incredible fast growth. So we became Read.co.uk, the specific part of the business and product that we were working on was separated out. We actually had 2 people in the chairman's office and 2 people in the IT department, or 3 when I joined. And then that group was, within about a year of me joining, 2 years of me joining, we were separated out. And so around 2001, so probably I'd been there 3 years at that point, we were moved into an office in central London, and it was all the things that you expect about a startup, completely crazy. There was some 36-hour day that I worked on the first day of our first ever TV campaign, and I had decided that I was going to rebuild the whole of search just before our campaign went live, which turned out to be a terrible idea. So all of those things that you hear about startup life, spending really long hours together, really close-knit teams, that was true. But there was this other really weird thing, that we were part of a family business that was funding us, and the management that we had, they were never going to sell, they were never going to exit. They were never actually, to an extent, going to give their staff any ownership of the business either. So we were paid a salary, and that was it. So there are a whole bunch of things that were really different. If you're a VC-backed startup, you have a particular ticking clock that comes from the VCs to pay the money back, and you have to exit. Whereas we were trying to build a business that would grow organically, and the number one name of the game, completely contrary to what you'd find in the VC, was profit. What we were actually looking for in the first 7 or 8 years, we were looking for break even. We were looking to cover our costs. We were actually a cost center for the business, and it's slightly strange because we gave everything away for free, which is actually how we became dominant in the UK market. But if we were in a VC,
it would be gross.
Your customer is the VC, so it's not your product is your growth. Your product is the number of people that you can sign up to the platform. But the people that are paying you are the VCs, and they're paying you that because they want to sell you as a business, whereas we were actually always a very, very product-centric organization. So I look back at that period with incredible gratitude to both Alec and James, because the freedom and the responsibility that they gave to a bunch of 20-year-olds to run this business was, absolutely unbelievable. And at the same time, we were still getting trained in how to do things the way that a bigger company would do them. So things like HR, I still remember having to learn how to do performance reviews, because I went in with a lot of really bad assumptions about, well, I'm good at managing this team and I'm going to do it this way, and we're all friends, we're a family, and I'm going to care for the people. And that's all fine until you hit a spate of bad performance, and then suddenly you realize that performance management is actually a really important thing, and you have to be able to give feedback and track that and audit it. So we were really lucky then that we had these sort of grown-ups in the room in HR and in legal and in finance to actually hold us to account for things that sometimes you might not if you're running your own business.
I would say, knowing you as I do now, you have some frustrations of teamwork in organizations. One of them is that you find that people undervalue teamwork. What do you think causes that, and why?
I think people. So actually, this was something I came quite late to. I actually was very resistant to this when we went through it. I enormously valued the teamwork that I had within my technical team, and I went through a number of big learning experiences. And one was that I actually had created a culture that was really quite almost antagonistic to some of the rest of the business. But later on, when I was working with Reed, 2007, we actually started charging for the product. So starting charging for the product meant that suddenly we had other types of people enter the business, and that was actually where the main growth of the business came. We were actually 25 people all the way from 2001 to 2007. Literally, it was 25 people, half in business, half in tech. And so I looked after the tech side of the business. And then suddenly we did this piece of work with a consultancy to figure out how to go from a free model to a paid model. And that didn't really change the technology so much, but it massively changed the business. And so suddenly we had salespeople in the business, and these are a very different type of person than we were used to. And I had built a very strong culture in my team, but not a healthy one. And
why was it not healthy?
Because we were very close knit, and the wall between us and other people was effectively insurmountable. So because we were close knit and we had a culture, and even sometimes when I was bringing people into the team, if you weren't, you hear this term cultural fit a lot, and I think that's actually quite toxic and quite poisonous, because in the situation like I had created, so it's not cultural fit, it's homogeneity, and
it's exclusionary.
That's exactly the right word. What we did is we looked that we had our little homogenous culture of people that fit in, that were a certain type of people doing a certain type of job, and then these aliens arrived, so people with a different culture and doing a different job, and I don't think we integrated them very well, and I think that continued for a number of years. One of the big things that changed it was we actually did we started doing leadership coaching with a consulting firm, a coaching firm that specialized in executive team leadership. But one of the lead coaches was ex-RAF. And we, again, had this amazing opportunity, just incredibly lucky that as it happened, the coaching that we were able to do was to go on the RAF officer selection. So actually go through the course that the RAF officers do. And I know this is close to your experience with the Army officer selection as well. And I went in the guy that we worked with was a guy called Jim, and Jim would tell you now I was a little shit when I did this. I went in, I stood there arms crossed, didn't want any part of it, thought I knew better.
So you were cynical about it from the off?
I was totally cynical, and then I watched what was actually happening, and completely almost did a complete 360, because what I watched was a couple of things. The way that the officer selection ran was actually the team were broken up into different groups of 5, and then these 5 groups, or these groups of 5, were followed around the officer selection course, having had a bit of a briefing, gone through a number of different exercises, and they rotated the leadership. so it was a group of 5. They did 5 different exercises throughout the day, and the leader moved from one person to another. And at every stage, they were trailed, and notes were taken by an RAF officer or somebody that had previously worked in the RAF that was going to give feedback. And after every session, that feedback was given to those individuals. And I thought what they're looking for is the leadership. And obviously what we heard a lot of in this new concept was introduced about followership, which was how important it was when you watch these people. And at this stage, I was effectively there and observing the way that all of these teams were working together, watching what happens when you have a leader and what happens to the other people when there is a leader. Are you arguing with them? Are you giving them space? Are you supporting them? Suddenly it really struck me how important being a good member of a team is. We're all told how important being a leader is, this idea of individualism and personal attainment and superiority, and that's very much a factor of Western culture. This idea of followership is incredibly strong in the army, and is actually much stronger in Eastern cultures as well. So you see it a lot more when you look at something like Lean and Agile and the Toyota production system. You see this idea of judging yourself on the success of the team being much stronger, but it was evident and reported on in this context. It's like, well, you might have done a great job as a leader, but you're doing a terrible job as a follower. You should just shut up. Like, there is a time for you to give your feedback, and after that, you shut up and do what you're told. You commit and you get on with that piece of work. And so I think even though I had spent a lot of time at this point, I was always nose deep in some management consulting book or organizational theory book or book about strategy. But this was the first time that I'd really had an opportunity to reflect on my management style, which was this: everyone's a family, and I'm going to do this by sort of sense, and I'm going to support the people that I'm with, but realized actually how exclusionary that was, because a lot of my style was you fit in with this existing group of people, and so I'm going to get my arms around you and I'm going to manage it, to something that became a little bit more ordered and disciplined, in that actually I not only is that not scalable, so that it was a mistake to have that in the first place, but also we have to do a much better job of thinking through how we train people to be inside teams. And I think if you reflect on the military, it's one of the oldest organizations in the world. Not any particular military, but
the institution of the military.
And it's an institution of teams, and it has to work at all different levels. And they naturally have become very systemic in a lot of systems thinking about how to make people work together. And also, one of the things that I have a deep respect for is they do it with people who are very young at a very volatile age in their development. So they're taking potentially 16 to 20-year-olds and bringing them into an environment where they haven't necessarily been taught how to work as a team, and then allowing them to do it. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the military being command and control, which when you watch it are actually completely the opposite. So that was a really big event, in a sort of epochal event in how I reflected on my management, and it changed how I thought about teams as well.
How far into your career at Reed were you when that happened?
Well, a long way, probably a decade.
I find fascinating that you've got this period of your career to reflect on where you were just doing what came naturally without really much intervention at all, and then suddenly you were paying a lot of attention to it.
Yeah, I think it wasn't necessarily that I was suddenly paying attention to it, because what I think is really interesting is I think I had an opportunity to come at it much more from first principles, to come at it from this beginner's mind, where a lot of it, these things that stick with you, if you have had to figure it out yourself rather than just watch a training video. And I think, and it wasn't just me, there were lots of people doing this. So there was me, and then there was this trusted group of people that were sort of my direct reports, and they had feedback. So we were all learning it together. It wasn't that I had to come up with everything myself. And there was a lot of really strong feedback. But I do think that coming at a lot of this from first principles, and then outright rejecting, because we had this opportunity because of where it was in time, that we were building software products at a point that wasn't necessarily very well understood. We were a web scale business at a point that there weren't very many of them. I think we felt like we had to do a lot of things that were novel, and so I definitely tried and tested and failed with a lot of things that in another business you wouldn't be allowed to do. But I think it gave us a culture of constant experimentation and evolution of what we were doing. And there was always this general movement towards some shared endpoint that the industry naturally tends towards some standardization. And so now if you go into any business, they all use Agile, or what they think is Agile, because they have been trained to do it. And there's a book that tells them the 5 things that they need to do to be Agile. But actually, I think you see a marked difference between people that have lived it and have done it a certain way and then reflected on, is that right or is it not? Whether they get the actual principle and the philosophy behind it, or whether they've just been trained. And I think we just had this, and it was 2 things. One, being allowed the freedom, because the industry was different, but also being allowed the freedom by a really lenient or supportive leadership team. In that, we had it was a family business where we had executives that could make any decision that they wanted. And so they were tough on us. There was a lot of things that they wanted back from us. But if I said, I want to change performance management for the tech team, I could probably get away with it. So I was in this incredibly privileged place. But at the same time, I wouldn't have been in that place without that support from the leadership team. But also, part of the reason they could make the decision was they couldn't say, I can take things that I'm doing elsewhere and apply it in here. So they had to give us some ability to be novel.
You mentioned Agile and Lean. I like that reflection on some people have read it and then they apply it, and then some people have practiced it and reflected on it, and hopefully the best practitioners do both. Do you think that industry overcomplicates these concepts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is an enormous amount of ceremony, and to be incredibly cynical, I think there is a very large amount of consultancy and coaching dollars spent on things that are entirely unnecessary. That doesn't mean that I think that the training is not important, but I think it is endemic going into a business and finding somebody that has a certificate but doesn't understand the principles. And I think it is extremely common to find teams that will tell you that they are doing Agile. And the reason that they believe that is they can tick the boxes that says, so in the case of software development, it'll be things like, we have stand-ups, we do sprint planning, we do a sprint demo, we have a retrospective, and so therefore we are Agile. And one of the things that I find is most egregious about the entire cult of Agile that has grown up, and bear in mind, I love Lean and Agile, but there is this cult of capital A Agile, and I think it completely misrepresents what it is to go into an organization where you have an Agile coach or a Scrum Master who is an individual who is there to facilitate the team, and they feel that their job is to ensure that the team are following all of the ceremonies that are set down in the Agile handbook. Fundamentally, the point of Lean, the point of the Toyota production system where Lean came from, is inspect and adapt. It never says you follow exactly the same process. In fact, what it says is the best people to make a change to any process are the people inside the organization doing the job. All of the literature that you find around Lean and Agile, and especially when you look at Toyota's, it's not its sole purpose, but amongst its most important purposes is to become a learning organization. And what it means by that is it's not the organization itself that's learning, it's all of the people inside the organization are inspecting, adapting, reflecting, passing on their learning to other people. And that for me is what we want to see in every team. We talk about what are the identifying characteristics of a team, but learning, and I used to say a lot, even before I had a good context for this, that if you're hiring an engineer and you want to retain people, you need to do 2 things. Make sure that they're working on something that is meaningful to them, and make sure that they feel like they're learning. And if you do those 2 things, even things like salary, outside of certain events, like they're moving home or getting married or having a baby, the salary is not important. But feeling like they're working on something meaningful to them and that they are constantly learning, those are the biggest motivators that any individual can have.
How does that translate to the team level of learning? You're talking about individuals learning here, but the concept of team learning behavior is something that's at a group level. Do you see that as a particularly important feature with Lean and Agile?
Well, that's exactly the outcome that Lean and Agile wants to see, is that, so particularly when we talk about Agile, we're really talking about applying Lean principles into software engineering. That's generally what we mean when we talk about capital A Agile. And so what we generally see is in a good software product engineering team, we are seeing a cross-functional team made up of different members. So they have not only different skills, but different seniorities. So that they do different things. So we have somebody thinking about product, and they are generally thinking about what should we build, and people on the engineering side thinking about how should we build it. And ideally, those teams will be quite long-lived. So they are not teams that come together and only work together for 2 or 3 months, 2 or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 months. They are generally going to, the aim is to have them together for more than that. And I think there are a couple of reasons that you would expect that to be true. One is that you would hope team performance to increase. And if team performance is increasing, then surely the way that that happens is the team are learning how to perform better together. So they're learning all of those things that could be, how do I make my disciplines work better together? What is a particular strength of one of the people on the team that somebody else can't have? And I think it's individual growth. So within the team enables individuals to learn. So it's passing knowledge from one person to another. So you can actually have, when you have the more junior people in the team, a fundamental part of what you would see in Agile software development is pair programming, where you have people working alongside and actually giving immediate feedback on how something is being developed. So giving that really, really meaningful feedback at the point of creation of the work. So I think the individuals are given a chance to learn, which improves the team performance, but the team is learning at the same time. So there's this broader thing that you actually see teams made up of average people can perform at a much higher level than the individual team members, because those teams have a method of communication or a culture or a set of goals that is actually inspiring them to be better. And you can see that performance change. And the reason that you can see a team go from average performance to high performance isn't because you've switched the members, but because the team has learned to improve its own performance.
Some of the understanding of team learning behavior identifies a relationship with team psychological safety. Is that something that you've seen?
It has become absolutely huge within software engineering, within modern product engineering teams, software development teams. I think everybody suddenly got switched onto it. It was a very, very significant part of a piece of work. Google ran 2 projects inside Google, and they've got this incredible population that they can run these tests of very high quality engineers. And they ran 2 projects, one called Aristotle and one called Oxygen. One was specifically looking at team behavior, the other was looking at manager behavior. But they really, really popularized from, and I think it's Amy Edmondson.
Yeah, I think it's Aristotle that identified
Aristotle.
Team psychological safety as a key feature. Yeah, Amy Edmondson's she is the superstar in that area.
And so I think what happened was, I don't think many people would have read Amy Edmondson's academic literature, but what happened was Google then referenced it, and there was a long set of studies and research which Google then published, and it's still that the outcomes of that are still available on the Google website today. So it's become one of those things that almost every company that I will then go and work with will talk about psychological safety. Lots of them not necessarily quite understanding it. There are quite a few people that think psychological safety is we're going to be nice to everyone, and that's not actually what I think the intention of that piece of work is. But I've definitely seen that is the psychological safety is an addition on top of things like Lean and Agile. So there's this cultural piece that has been layered on top of Lean and Agile. It's not specifically part of it. But what you would do is, if philosophically you look at some of the things that are stated inside the goals of the Toyota production system about having respect for people and about giving feedback. And those 2 things are quite interesting as well. In Hattie McCord's book, which I think is called Powerful, which is about the Netflix culture, she talks a lot about the importance of feedback. And it's very, very similar in the Radical Candor book by Kim Scott. The importance of feedback and the importance of not pulling your punches when you give feedback. And I think people think that there is that psychological safety means that you won't get mean feedback. But there's a very delicate line that you have to have a culture that allows people to give direct and useful feedback, which could be a little bit hurtful when you hear it if you're not prepared to receive it. And so it's building a culture that allows people to feel comfortable receiving that feedback, which if they've never been in that culture is going to be very difficult the first time that they've had it. And they need to see that demonstrated through leadership. So they need to see people at the top of the business receive feedback and understand from witnessing them take feedback how they should do it. Because I think a lot of people are just told, and this is where it really looks like bullying. You go and talk to somebody who is more senior than you are. I'm going to give you some radical candor now. I'm going to give you some feedback. You sucked in that presentation. It's like, no, that's bullying. That's not, that is definitely not psychological safety, but nor is it actually what is intended by the concept of radical candor. So I think what we do see is a lot of these things like radical candor and like psychological safety have started just like lean and agile. They've started from a set of principles and they've been slightly misinterpreted as they've flowed into the zeitgeist of sort of modern management.
How do you reflect on that original family environment you thought you were creating at Reed? Where did psychological safety feature in that? And how does the concept of psychological safety relate to those instinctive notions of what a family is?
So it definitely felt like a family. And when we've spoken with people on this podcast, I think we've realized as well how important things like eating together are. And I grew up in a family business. It wasn't very big. It was about 50 people, but we would do things. So I grew up surrounded by mechanics, and going for a tea break was really important. Bringing cake in on birthdays was really important. And having bacon sandwiches together was really important. And what was really interesting is I sort of brought that into my approach. I'd been in a family business that felt like a family, and I brought that into my small team. And for the next 10 years, I went and bought the sandwiches. I didn't necessarily always pay for them, but I went and picked up the sandwiches and came back. And there was a big thing about feeding people. And I think that really led to this, we are a family. And it's actually something else that Patty McCord had said about you really don't want it to feel like a family. That's not appropriate. And my learning for that was, I think in the early years, I was definitely too nice. There's this difference between nice and being nice and being kind. And I wanted to avoid situations where I was giving tough feedback. I think we all, that's the natural direction we all want to go in. I don't want to give tough feedback. And it wasn't until I'd had to go through some really unpleasant situations where I'd had to ask people to leave the business, normally that their performance wasn't meeting a standard, where it suddenly hit me just after having one of these conversations. Maybe for years I avoided having a hard conversation, and now I'm having a heartbreaking one. And if I had much earlier turned around and said, actually, these are the ways that you're not meeting expectations, that you're letting your team down, I think that was the moment where I thought, moving towards some of these things, like really institutionalizing how to give feedback, giving feedback very frequently, training people how to give feedback and how to receive it as well. So really giving people the tools that they need to do that became really important. And that even when I was at Reed, even when I'd had 18 years in the same business, I still had an enormous amount to learn, and have picked up lots more from all the businesses that I've worked with since. I don't think your journey ever ends. I think you're always seeking to learn and improve, but definitely that point where I sat there having to ask somebody to leave a job and thought, I have let them down so badly, because they have probably been here thinking they're doing a perfectly reasonable job for a couple of years, and I knew it wasn't working, but I wanted to avoid that situation, just say nice things. So I think somebody referred to it as toxic positivity, this concept that all you do is you give compliments and you sort of lift everyone up and you tell them that they're wonderful, but actually that is the wrong thing to do for the team. I think it's critical for teams that you make sure that poor performance isn't tolerated, because it's such a negative impact on the overall team itself. So it's one of those things where if one person is allowed to underperform, then you will maintain good performance from the other team members for a period of time, and then they'll look around and say, well, how come I'm working really hard and they're not? And suddenly that's this incredibly toxic bomb that you can drop on a team.
Well, the concept of tolerating as well, I think, comes with connotations, doesn't it? People say, we will not tolerate X or Y. That sounds command and control, dictatorial. but tolerance is also something that's part of the climate of the team. So how much does the team tolerate performance, and how much does the individual who's underperforming, how much do they tolerate their level of performance for the sake of their other teammates? And in a psychologically safe environment, that conversation would be something that was possible, wouldn't it? In an unsafe environment, I think the idea of toxic positivity is a really good example of toxic positivity is something you would expect to find in a psychologically unsafe environment, but it's also something that people who haven't fully got to grips with the concept of team psychological safety would probably point to something like positivity as an example of team psychological safety.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's exactly right.
So in the spirit of positivity, hopefully not toxic positivity, what lessons do you think tech could teach teams in other industries?
Tech has a number of real benefits from where it has been, especially in the last 20 years, because it's seen so much growth and it's such a new way of working. So I think lots of people, and this is actually one of the areas where, again, there is a really fundamental misconception of using lean and agile in the way that most tech happens. The Toyota production system is an amazing thing, but it's for mass manufacturing cars, and you can apply that in other industrial situations. But I was incredibly fortunate to actually get to go to a Toyota factory and watch how it is applied. So actually watch really what does the Toyota production system mean. So what do these things, we hear in tech like the and-on cord, which is if there is a quality problem, I'm going to pull this cord, I'm going to tell the whole factory to shut down until I fixed it. And these things we talk about in tech, we've reflected on in tech, but there is a real fundamental difference in producing something to a spec as it passes in front of you and ensuring the quality of that thing. Lots of people think that tech is the same. Even executives in tech companies feel, well, this is just, it's a factory, it's a breakfast factory. So what we're going to do is we're going to just be shipping these items. The point with tech is it's primarily creative. The first problem is you don't really know what you're going to build. So you have this particular skill set thinking about customers. 15 years ago, we didn't have product as a discipline. So this idea of product owners and product managers didn't really exist 15 years ago. It's quite emergent. And that has been really strongly influenced by design thinking. So you see the way that product goes out and they do their customer research. Weirdly, the point that my degree actually became appropriate was going out and thinking about things like user research and quant and qual analysis. So bizarrely, my degree actually set me up quite well to move into these new disciplines of user experience, user interface design, product management, and service design as well. So what tech got to do was take a lot of tech, and I'm including the product discipline in that. So we're talking about actually building products with technology. We got to reflect and adopt a lot of the design thinking that IDEO about products that are really unknown when you first start with them. You're trying to solve a customer problem, and you have to move in these waves of very creative thinking, and then refining that back down again into something that you can produce, and then giving that to the market, seeing what their feedback is, and then trying all the opportunities again. And so the first part is we often don't know what we're building, and in order to work in that area of very high uncertainty, so we often don't know exactly what the end product is, which is very different to how tech was 20 years ago, where we would have written a whole bunch of specifications and try and ship it by a certain date. Now, generally, what we're trying to do is ship just enough that we can learn, but that means that those teams have to be cross-functional. So generally inside tech, what you see is that there are people with lots of different skills that are having to work together on particular outcomes. So we really do see cross-functional teams. And we also, I think, have done a pretty good job in tech, even though I was quite mean about it earlier. I think we've done a pretty good job at reflecting some of those lean and agile principles into what we do. So short iterations, shipping regularly, understanding quality. So we've taken a lot of the principles that came out of Toyota production system and lean. The principles themselves, I think, have been dropped into the tech environment. The other thing is that a lot of tech businesses, again calling out Google and Netflix specifically, have had the resources to really think about exactly how do I make high performance teams. And what has been really, really interesting is see probably in ways that wouldn't have been, we wouldn't have been able to do if we only had academia to do it. They have been able to reflect on their culture and think deeply about how do I improve the performance. And I think that bleeds through. The rest of the tech industry looks to what's the next big thing that's happening, whether it's performance management, things like psychological safety. I think they were driven inside this whole industry because Google adopted it. So Google made it famous, just like Atlassian and their approach to performance reviews. They did something, and then everybody starts reflecting on it. So I don't think it is unique to tech, but I think because we're working with digital products, the turnaround and actually the investment in those, the upfront cost is very low. It's still expensive, but it's not nearly as expensive as manufacturing. We don't hold stock. So we have these creative problems to solve, and then we can move very, very quickly to solve them and to deliver something to the customer. And so I think that means that those short cycles, we can come back and we can reflect on what does that mean to us as a team? Are we actually moving in the right way? There are lots of anti-patterns, but I think your question was more, what are the positive things we can learn? And I think it's that sense of having cross-functional teams, having small teams. It's very rare to find teams that are bigger than about 10 people. I think we've learned some of those lessons. Not being strongly wedded to hierarchy. Most tech companies are generally getting away from very, very strong levels of seniority as well. So I think that there is lots of good stuff in there, but there are also missteps along the way.
When you're describing that, I'm thinking it's unusual that you have a sort of institutionally sized sector that is almost exclusively private and profit driven, or growth driven. Maybe we should be more precise about it.
Yeah.
That is also endeavoring to solve or address more fundamental, let's call them problems, for want of a better expression, in the service of that capitalist profit driven goal. So I'm thinking of going back to Google, Google Maps. There's a commercial reason why that exists, but yet it's solving a problem that confronts everybody at an everyday non-commercial level. And then it's operating on a scale that's unmatched, really.
Yeah.
So it's these different features make it able to offer those returns, I suppose, to things like our understanding of teams in a way that isn't accessible. Even if you think of massive institutional spaces like healthcare, government, I'm sure there are plenty of others people can think of. Okay, you talked about anti-patterns. What does it get wrong?
What does tech get wrong? I think in a lot of organizations there was a massive overemphasis on academic qualifications, so intellectual capability in tech. So lots of people raced to the best universities to get the best graduates, the typical milk round type situation. And I think that misses out on a huge part of the market. I think it's much better now. We've seen some fantastic growth in coding boot camps that will even particularly target people from less privileged backgrounds. But I think it is entirely possible to be a brilliant product manager or a brilliant engineer and have absolutely no academic background whatsoever. And the way that I always used to think about it, and I think probably because I grew up with mechanics, is I grew up with mechanics and went to an engineering university, and I was often really surprised at the lack of mechanical sympathy that I found in engineers. That they had an extremely impressive intellectual understanding of how much torque you could apply to a bolt, but they had no feel. And I'd grown up surrounded by mechanics who had served an apprenticeship, learnt their craft, and would know absolutely by feel how tight something should be. And I think there is a deep, deep wisdom that is not measured correctly but by looking at academic qualifications or intellectual capability. So I think tech did get that wrong. I think it is much better now. But seeing, and through my career as well, I focused a lot on trying to find people and give them the opportunity to try these things, to try growing in different roles inside technology, and absolutely require them to have any kind of academic background at all. I think it is improving, but I definitely think that, especially if you looked at the biggest companies, there was an arms race in the US. The tech companies were generally based around the best universities. So you find the startup ecosystems around Stanford in the US, or in Boston around MIT. I also think that it's a really interesting thing about this individualism, very Western culture of achievement and advancement. And it's not specific to tech, but I think what you do find is lots of extremely well-paid, highly intelligent people sparring with each other for advancement. And I think that's a deeply cultural thing. I don't think tech is to blame. I just think what you see is effectively displaying the worst elements of Western culture. And I think in a lot of other cultures, you have seen much more commitment to the team, where they're not the individual advancement isn't nearly so important. The success is we as a team are performing. And I think in tech, it probably gives a sense if you're not progressing, you're a failure. And I know lots of people inside tech that have been incredibly happy in their careers writing code. That was what made them happy. Solving problems, creating solutions, that made them happy. And they felt that because they needed this pressure on them to be seen to be progressing. If you're in the organization, you're not progressing, you're a failure. That then meant it drove them out of jobs that they were brilliant at into jobs that they were very unhappy in, because progression was everything.
Do you think tech is having to re-engineer the concept of teamwork, partly because of this cultural trend towards individualism and high individual performance and attainment?
Yeah, I do. I think it's having to put checks and balances in because of that. But again, I've had to pick up a lot of the old management books, the old consultancy books, because we're going through this process of looking at the book that we're writing. And so I've been reflecting on what are the lessons that they had in there. And to an extent, nothing has changed in 50 years. It's all still the same stuff, even elements of psychological safety in terms of communication and goal setting, all the things, everything in Google's Oxygen and Aristotle, everything that we look at about what is the current state of the art, they were in Katzenbach's book or Senji's book. So it's really, really interesting. I think, yes, to an extent, we are getting better at putting some of those things in place and understanding what we need to do to focus on teamwork. But I think they were already there, and there were already people trying to impose those things. Fortunately, we've got away. Actually, I say that it's still used in some places. We've got away from things like stack ranking that Jack Welch had in GE. So I think we are leaving some things aside, but I do think it's a continuation of exactly the same pattern.
Your job, you're a serial CTO, was how I would describe you. You get drafted into a company in a CTO role, which sounds very exciting and glamorous. But you go into a CTO role. Are you bringing those assumptions with you, or what are your usually reliable assumptions you can make about going into an organization and the teams that you'll encounter when you go there?
I've picked up some, I guess, habits, not necessarily skills, but habits going into different organizations recently. Because I was in one place for a long time. And so the first time I moved, it was very difficult. And now I've moved several times, almost several times a year, business to business. And sometimes I will go into business and just be coaching on the periphery. And sometimes I'll actually be taking the role. I almost invariably get asked to go in and somebody says, we're not going fast enough. Can you help us go faster? And invariably the finger points at tech, because they are seen as the unit of delivery. So it's like tech isn't fast enough. And again, invariably, the reason is probably not that there is a problem with tech, whether it's the tech stack or the people, that they're generally pretty good. But there is a deep problem with objective setting and prioritization. And that almost every single business I've ever been in is trying to do too much and is not making the right decisions on what not to do, and also is not either communicating what those objectives are to the team or protecting them enough from these other side of job projects. That invariably is true. And so that's actually one of the reasons that I've spent probably more of my career focusing on things like how do you do prioritization? How do you think about strategy? How do you think about goal setting and communication than I do technical architectures. This is the point I made about the beginning. My job is people. It's not the actual technology, or at least the majority of it is people. So invariably, tech isn't the problem. Tech itself isn't the problem, but there will be structures, and almost always around prioritization and goal setting that aren't done as well as they should be. There is also, it's generally quite a surprise if people have teams that are really aligned around outcomes. So ideally, the thing that we always want to see, so going back to what does an ideal team look like, the teams, the tick box of what a brilliant team looks like, and it's almost impossible for it to happen, but you have a small, certainly less than 12 people, probably less than 10 people. You have a small team that is cross-functional. It has people with different skills in it. They have all of the skills that are required to deliver an outcome. They know exactly what their outcome is, and they are given autonomy to achieve it. And they don't have dependencies on other teams. And invariably, that's never true. So, but that's really what you want. It's like, here is a team. It is accountable for things. It knows what it has to do, and it is part of a larger whole. It's extremely rare that you would ever see that.
I would add one specific feature to that description, which I completely agree with, which is going back to your point about the cultural convention towards individualism, which is there's often a complete assumption, and this is represented in literature, there's often a complete assumption that the individual members of the team their individual goals align with whatever is considered to be the team's objectives. And when you've got something as powerful as Western individualism pulling in a different direction, it's not surprising sometimes that teams don't seem to be getting off the ground.
Yeah, the other surprising thing is just how much people do want to work together. It's such a natural state for us to be in a team. And almost inevitably, the teams themselves are saying, I wish that somebody could just tell me what I was responsible for. I wish that we didn't have so many things to do. So the people in the teams almost implicitly know what they need. And generally, most teams are very happy to be working together. And you definitely do see dysfunctions in teams, 100%. But I feel like a lot of the problems for performance of teams is not necessarily inside the team itself. There's a lot more that we can do to help the team, but it's how that team and how teams of teams are integrated together. That's where the problem actually becomes. So the clarity of purpose to a team and the clarity of purpose to an individual is really key. To your point, people want to know they're doing a good job, but it's really weird because it's the individual is incentivized to want to progress, but often they're totally happy in the team. So although I've just been talking about tech gets this wrong, I really feel like the organization is incentivizing people to strive for that individualism, and to an extent it's promoting that culture. You know, are you getting promoted? How much do you earn? All of these discussions in the background that are scoring people against each other. But I think the natural inclination of people is to want to work together in a team because it's actually more profound than working on individually, and they want to achieve things as a team, and so they just want that celebration moment of, I've done the thing that I was asked to do. So, can you do this? Yes, I've done it. And then you get to celebrate, and then you get to have a bit of a break and then start again. And I think that, yes, there is individualism, but weirdly, I don't think it's the individual specifically drive. In some cases it is, but I think in the main, it's not the individual driving the individualism, it's the organization driving the individualism.
Yeah, taking a kind of sociological view of it, you see the structures and forces that are playing, that are getting in the way of the team.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could say. So those individuals can't help but be participants in a system, and if the only reward structures that exist are for them as individuals, and from above there's interference around about objective setting, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes just for the sake of being in control. All of those things start to fight against good teamwork, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And weirdly, that's the thing, right? The job of managers is really fundamentally to help the teams perform better than they would on their own. Otherwise, there's no point in having the manager. And so it's actually protecting protecting teams from the way that an organization is going to interfere with their performance. And I do see a lot of the times I see people that are absolutely committed and doing the very best that they can on their own. They're just not aligned with the right outcomes, and something really simple has been missed. It's just like someone saying, this is the overall problem that you can contribute to, but it was badly explained, and so you have people really working their hearts out to deliver something. They're deeply committed to it. They're deeply committed to the rest of their team. And to them, it's almost heartbreaking and extremely demoralizing when they deliver something that hasn't moved the needle, but it's because they weren't ever actually told what they should be working on clearly.
I imagine that also little micro incidences of that sort of stuff create scar tissue in an organization as well, which it makes the membrane, to extend the metaphor slightly, makes it less flexible, and therefore trying to institute a more effective way of using and maximizing the value of teams becomes more difficult, because relationships are frayed, systems have been designed around that old way of doing things, and dismantling that is too difficult. It's easier just to go with the slightly uncomfortable and underwhelming status quo.
I think the use of that term scar tissue is right, and to me the first thing that dropped into my head when you said it was it's distrust. The thing that you will see in poorly performing teams is distrust of the organization to help them in whatever way it is that they need help, and that is a scar tissue. And it's also, I've always thought that culture is just organizational habit. Culture is not a culture deck. It's not a set of principles that you learn. It's just, like I said, somebody going out and buying bacon sandwiches on a Friday morning. That's cultural, but it's a learned habit. And often people forget where the original thing came from. But I think that scar tissue is part of that learned habit. So if it's complaining about managers, that's part of the learned habit. Or these people don't understand me. These people are useless. They never listen to us. They never communicate. The us and them of the management. And I think that speaks really strongly to, and again, it's Patty McCord talks about it in her book, but really overemphasizing communication. And it's a really interesting line inside an organization to tread between, why do we have to have all these meetings telling us stuff? I've just got another email. This is all completely pointless. But trying to get to a point where people actually feel like they understand things. And generally, one of the things that you hear when you run internal surveys of how teams are doing, do you know what you're supposed to be doing? Do you know what the company goals are? The answer is always no, and generally it's you don't communicate with us. We have too many meetings where you're telling us stuff, but you don't communicate enough with us, and it's a real problem trying to solve for those two things. But I do think that the way to try and change the culture to work out that scar tissue, it takes an awfully long time. And I think some people try and change teams, will try and move a team, whether it's an entire organization or a single team, from one state to another state way too quickly. And what happens is they snap back. They either snap or snap back. So you try and push them very quickly through a transformation. Digital transformation is all the rage. But a transformation that sticks is a transformation that happens slowly and thoughtfully and involving everybody inside the organization. And having people skilled at communicating that change is a really big part of it. And often that's not the managers. The managers have different skills. So I think that concept of scar tissue is really important, because we all know if that was a body, if it was an organism that had scar tissue, it takes a long time to work that out and to work around it and to make it flexible again. And that's exactly what it's like being in an organization that is in a period of pain and dysfunction.
Well, I'm going to go back to the thing that you said, that most people really want to work in teams, and it is a rewarding dynamic in which to participate, but it's also functionally something that can create things that otherwise wouldn't exist. So, and you see that in your experiences that people really do want to. Sometimes things are getting in their way, and sometimes people are getting in their own way on the basis of culture that's reinforced. Yeah, not necessarily their own fault, but they're getting in their own way by looking for their individual reward, which detracts from the team. But I'm going to just hold on to that idea of your experiences. people really do value and get intrinsic high reward from being members of teams, which is great to hear. I think it's time to move on to quick fires.
Great. I've been looking forward to this.
Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
So I'm going to start with, what are your team red flags?
I think we have probably mentioned them in what we've spoken about so far, but to be very specific, the first red flag is poor individual performance being tolerated. So one of the most toxic things that you can see inside a team is somebody not pulling their weight, and that can survive for a short term, but it can't survive in the long term. What will happen is people are incredibly sensitive to unfairness, almost more than anything else. The thing that they look for is, am I being fairly treated? And as soon as they see poor performance being tolerated, it feels extremely unfair, and it will have the rest of the team suddenly in full revolt because there is one person who isn't pulling their weight, and that can actually lead on to a lot of the other red flags.
Tolerated or rewarded, even sometimes.
So sometimes rewarded, and that would definitely be the exception. Most people are lacking in some competence to manage the performance, but not willfully ignoring it. Sometimes you can absolutely see where it's not a meritocracy, and there is some very dark behaviours happening where poor performance is rewarded for other reasons. Let's say nepotism or something external to their individual performance. The other red flag, and this is one, it's closely related to that, but it's when you see a point where you know that a team is in crisis is when you see disdain, when you see a lack of respect between individual members. And one of the things that I thought was really, really interesting, I came across this years ago, was I think it's John Gottman, psychologist, came up with this idea of the four horsemen, and it's particularly thinking about romantic relationships, and it talks about these four particular things that you can look for in a relationship, and this concept of disdain being one of them. And what struck me when I was reading that was that is so closely associated with, because obviously a romantic relationship and a team relationship actually aren't that different. A lot of these roles are actually totally codependent. And at the point that you see, it's not just a fight, it's not a disagreement, but as soon as you see that moment that somebody slips from going from giving feedback to actually sneering at somebody else in the conversation, for whatever reason, it's a very emotional, very basic, very animalistic response that I think that's the point that you've got a deep interpersonal problem inside a team, and so something needs to be done. It's almost certain somebody will need to be removed from that team. Whichever way round it is, it could be almost the aggressor or the aggressed in that situation. A lot of the times it's bidirectional. But I think it's a really, really strong signal that there are some deep interpersonal problems. Sometimes it can be coached out, but often, very rarely. It's rare that I would find that somebody that's got to that state would be able to address it. So keeping it very simple, those are the two big ones. So this idea that there is poor performance which is tolerated for whatever reason for too long, that will kill a team. And then this thing between team members is, if you get to the stage where there is a problem between team members and they get to the point of disdain more than anything else, then it speaks to a lack of trust and all kinds of other problems. But as soon as you see that marker, it's crippling for a team.
Best team memory.
I don't think it will surprise anybody who has listened to the rest of this to hear that it's probably that period, especially the early period that I was working at Reed. And I would probably struggle to pick out one particular memory, but it's definitely a type of memory. I think that our best memories of teams collectively, even when I've spoken with other people, our best memories of teams are when we've come out of the other end of something that was really high stress, something that was really difficult. And for me, most of those occurred in the early part of my career. And it was things like if we were moving servers between data centers, these big places where your servers live, And we had a weekend where we had to work really, really hard together. So it was, buying the pizza, going without sleep for a couple of nights, trying to get 15 minutes of sleep on the sofa in the office as you did it, and being surrounded by those people. Though those were, to an extent, those are the lifelong friendships that you created. So it's definitely those early in my career. So definitely in my 20s, and surrounded by probably a team of less than 10 people who were living these shared experiences. One specific one to call out super early, we had this TV ad. We'd spent a lot of money on it, more money than I think any of us had ever seen in a budget before. Very first TV ad that Reed had ever run, and I decided for some reason I would rewrite the application on the night before the TV campaign was running, and I had to work overnight with two guys. And I distinctly remember when it was all over, the TV ad had run, we'd got everything working again. It was a terribly stupid idea, but it was 11 o'clock and we were in the city of London, and our office overlooked a pub, and we looked out the window and realised that the pub was just opening. And so after about literally 36 hours of non-stop work, we walked out of the office and straight into the pub and drank a pint, only to see the doorman was in there. So the guy, the doorman of the office, had let himself in there, and his regular thing was an 11 o'clock pint.
He went for a pint.
So it was a real high stakes, high pressure moment for us, and getting to the end of it, it was his normal Tuesday morning. But there you go, that was.
Love it. So it's kind of like being in the trenches together.
It definitely, yeah, absolutely.
And finally, a resource on teamwork that you would pass on.
I've been thinking a lot about this. So I would have loved to have said something about Lean and Agile, but I think it's quite a long path to get into it, and there isn't necessarily a really good jumping off spot to go through. But definitely, if you get an opportunity to read any of the old literature, Taichi Ono has a book on the Toyota production system. They are incredibly interesting, and there are a lot of the roots. When I talk about Lean and Agile, that's really where I would say to go to. But the thing that I would give to our audience, that I think is just very accessible and covers a lot of topics, is Work Rules by Laszlo Bock from Google. And I think I've mentioned Powerful by Patty McCord a couple of times, but I think Laszlo's book does this really good job. It talks specifically about Google, but his experience is broader than that. But it introduces a number of the concepts that we've been talking about, the good ones, the things that we hold really, really close to our hearts. And so I think it's just a really nice introduction. So it's actually called Work Rules, Insights from Inside Google that will transform how you live and lead. That's the official name of the book.
Oh, well, of course, make sure that we link to that in the show notes. Mark, thanks so much
You're very welcome.
Spending so much time and going into so much detail. It's been a really interesting trip through your career history and your perspectives and your experience on working in teams, leading teams, and generally in organizations and technology. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for listening, and thank you to Mark. In the show notes, you'll find links to Mark's work. You'll also find Mark's Pass It On resource, Work Rules by Laszlo Bock. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.